Welcome. I'm Leslie Canham.
I'm Mary Gavoni.
I'm Linda Harvey.
I'm Olivia Wan, and together we are the Compliance Divas.
Hello, I'm Leslie Canham, and I will be your moderator for today's podcast with the Compliance Divas. And I'm so excited today. We have a very special guest to talk about something that we all have in our offices, but really don't pay much attention to, and that is our oxygen tank. Most of us keep our CPR training up to date, and we know where to locate our patient emergency kit or crash cart. But if there's a medical emergency, do you know where your oxygen tank is, how to hook up the hoses and start the flow of oxygen? Does your tank have enough oxygen to deliver? Do you know how often to check it? And have you ever conducted team training on each person's role in an emergency situation? Do you have a written emergency action plan? Our podcast guest today is Henry Serrano of Blue Ocean Safety, and Henry says every second counts, and how you respond can save a life. We bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating regulatory compliance to keep you on course. We ask our listeners to subscribe to the Compliance Divas podcast through the favorite podcast channel, and also we're available for subscription on our website, thecompliancedivas.com. Resources that we mention today during our podcast can be located on the compliancedivas.com website, and we always welcome questions to support@thecompliancedivas.com. Henry, we're so glad to have you with us today. Welcome. You and I go back many, many years, and we actually first met at a dental meeting. You provide first aid and CPR training for healthcare professionals, and you've been to many dental offices. Being based in Fresno, California, we know that you travel to other states. In your 12 years of experience, I bet you've seen a lot of dangerous errors when it comes to the emergency oxygen tank. Tell us about some of the things that you experience while we're on this podcast together. And again, I want to welcome you, and I want to introduce you to our compliance diva, Linda, who wants to kick off our questions for you.
Well, great. Well, thank you for letting me here on the podcast today. And so, yes, it's a great subject. And I think it's an important subject that a lot of dental offices sort of overlook. And so some of the things that I have seen in regards with that, obviously, is the proper storage of the tanks, not having the proper equipment, not even checking the equipment. I think that's another mishap that a lot of people don't do and overlook. And so, yes, there's a lot of great situations that they should be able to have this as part of their routine, over checking and looking in regards with their office and any type of safety and compliance things that they should be aware of.
Well, Henry, I'm Linda Harvey, and I'm so excited that you're here today because I've seen so many faux pas and so many unsafe conditions that not only do you have the dental background, but you've got such a depth of background in this whole area of safety. So this is going to be fantastic for our listeners. I would like to ask you, Henry, could you address just where should the tank, the hoses, and the mask be stored? And could you make a couple comments about the ambu bag? I'm not sure everybody really knows the role of that bag and why and when you should use that versus, for example, the oxygen mask on their nitrous system.
Great question, Linda. And so, I'll focus a little bit on California, but also there's also federal regulations. But here in California, the Department of Industrial Relations requires these what I call combustible oxygen tanks to be stored at least in a safe and well-ventilated area. And they also should be in a dry location, and they should be at least at a minimum 20 feet away from any type of other combustible stuff, any oils or anything in regards with it. So storage is very key. Ventilations are one of the key things, because sometimes I see some of these oxygen tanks actually, stored in a cupboard, which they shouldn't be, and that's enclosed with that. Also, when we talk about the hoses and everything else, they should be checked and well maintained at least monthly in regards with it. And so that's something there that they want to be able to have that properly stored, and it should be stored in a secured type of place in an area where it can't be tipped over or tripped over or knocked over in regards with it. And so the key thing also with that ambu bag, which you brought up a very good point, that is another situation where that important ambu bag needs to be basically attached to that oxygen tank. And some of the differences, and you brought up a good valid point about the differences between an ambu bag or what we call a bag mask valve. With that bag mask valve, it has to be in good working order and condition. And so when somebody goes into cardiac arrest, obviously when we talk about CPR, it's two simple techniques. It's chest compressions and rescue breaths. And so when you're initially starting the chest compressions, once you do your 30 compressions, you're going to need to administer oxygen. Now, some people may have a regular pocket mask, which is fine, and that's good in the interim while you're maybe waiting to connect to that ambu bag. But one of the things here is the ambu bag, what it'll do is it'll distribute oxygen at 100%. And the way that you administer that is when you gently squeeze that bag, it releases the valve, which has the oxygen stored within that oxygen tank and in the bag, and it goes into the individual. Then when you let go of that bag, it refills again, and then you open up the valve again by squeezing the bag. And what it does, then it gives it second oxygen. So with the ambu bag, you have controlled rescue breaths, where if you have that hooked up to a consistent just oxygen mask, you have continuous flow of oxygen. So at that point, when they have to do the chest compressions, if you have continuous oxygen going into the body, it's going to be counterintuitive. And so it'll affect those chest compressions, or you'll have to remove the mask. So with the ambu bag, it gives you more control and more ease in regards of giving rescue.
That was such a great explanation, Henry, because I think many offices mistakenly think we have plumbed nitrous, we'll just use that mask, and they don't really think through the next couple of steps and what the repercussions could be for the safety of the patient. So to take it a step further, I've seen them kind of all nasty and stuck in the corner and, kind of crusty and just, plastic gets hard and sticky. So where should they store it? You mentioned a little bit about it already, but how do they keep it clean and dust free? And then just could you go in again to a little bit of the federal OSHA laws as far as regulation for the oxygen tanks, as well as California laws for our California listeners?
Right. So for California, as I mentioned, with the Department of Industrial Relations, it's code 4650, and that's what it's mentioning, that they have to be stored in a well ventilated area in regards with it, and very easy accessible. So the thing here is when we talk about the ambu bag, the storage of that ambu bag actually has to be sealed within that plastic bag to have that sterile. That's one of the things here, because if it's not enclosed within that plastic bag, you are going to have exposure as far as dust and everything else that could be on that bag. So the ambu bag itself typically is stored right on the oxygen tank, but it needs to be sealed. So by sealing that, then you're not going to be able to have a lot of that dust or anything else get on there, as time goes on in regards with it. Now, the other thing that you mentioned with the hoses, yes, that's definitely one of the things that you want to be able to make sure is that there's no cracks or any seals that are on there on the hoses. And so when we look at that certain situation, that's why you want to be able to have it inspected at least monthly. Now, when we talk about all the other states, they fall under the guidelines of federal OSHA, which in there it is section 1910.104. And so this gives us a general idea of what the federal OSHA requires as far as storage of oxygen cylinders and tanks.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying, Henry. Leslie, back to you.
Thanks, Linda. And now Mary had some questions about the oxygen tank itself. So if you would kindly take from here, Mary, and proceed.
Thanks, Leslie. And thank you again, Henry, for being here with us. This is such great information. I have a question about how often dental teams should be checking their oxygen tank, and what level should the regulator show, and how do we know, is there color coding? What's the scoop on checking the tank?
That's a great question, Mary. And that, I think, is probably one of the main deficiencies within most dental offices, is that their staff being trained, on that oxygen tank and how to correctly connect the oxygen tank, how to turn it on at that point, and then how to read the dial. And so those are one of the things that they should at least be able to do. Now, most dental offices may have their own oxygen supplier in regards with it. So they should have that supplier, at least have everybody become very familiar with that particular oxygen tank. And so one of the things here, when we talk about oxygen tanks, there's something called a PSI, pressure per square inch. And so on that dial itself, what you'll read on there is it'll show the PSIs on there, and it'll be 0 all the way up to maybe 1,000 or 2,000, just depending on the cylinder they have. You want to have at least a minimum of 500 PSI, and that's at a 50% level. And so that's one of the things that you want to make sure, that it is already at least half full tank. Ideally it's 3/4. Once it drops below that half level, then that's where you need to change out that oxygen tank. And so this is why it's very key and important to check this oxygen tank once a month, and so they can include that with their safety office checklist that either the compliance officer or the office manager should have on that checklist and sign off on it every single month, but include the oxygen tank and ambu bag connection in regards with it.
Oh, such good information to know. And I think it's, again, something that people kind of take for granted, that it's there, and the supplier brings us tanks, so everything is good. What about the hoses, Henry? You mentioned before that you don't want cracks in the hoses, obviously, because you're not going to be delivering enough oxygen. Are there any other situations, or again, how often, when should you replace those hoses?
Mary, great question. And that's always a key question. This is why I want to have each offices typically develop that monthly checklist, as far as overall with their office and everything being in compliance. But one of the things that they also need to do is they actually need to connect the hoses and actually turn on the tank. That is the best way to check if there's any leaks or anything as far as possible connections or cracks in those hoses. So the best thing to do is to connect it and actually turn the oxygen tank on to go ahead and let that check all the hoses and make sure that everything's connected quickly. And also everything is very functional in regards with it.
Henry, I have a follow-up question for what Mary was asking. You talk about the hoses. So are we saying and recommending that the hoses should always be connected to the tank, or only when we're testing it? Which of the hoses? I'm thinking of the tubing, the long, little bit tubing, and I'm forgetting the exact title of it now, but I've seen it and I've used it myself, for patients. So could you just direct us on that for a moment?
Yeah, great question. So typically we like to have those hoses also stored in regards with them. So not being constantly connected to that. Because during that time, like I said, there could be damage, there could be wear on the connection because they're constantly on there. So they should only be used, like I said, for either testing or in use. So those hoses should at least be, especially the ambu bag hose, should at least, have that connection very solid on there. And so the only time that I would probably say that it's connected is it's while in use or while in testing.
Okay, good to know. Good to know, because I think that's an important point, because if it's already connected and it's not even protected, from the dust and whatnot, then, that's when it gets kind of like the sticky, grimy feeling that I was describing with all that nasty dust on it. Nobody wants to use it then. Diva Olivia couldn't be here today, but Mary, I know she had some important questions about the skills and training. Those are some areas that Olivia is really big on. So could you, pose those questions for Olivia?
Absolutely. Olivia, as well as rest of the rest of the divas, are, and I understand from what you've shared with us already, Henry, that you are very big on training and pre-planning and knowing what to do. So what are some must-know steps of oxygen tank training?
Mary, great question. And so one of the things also, as you can see, is I've included a checklist on a step-by-step process that each medical assistant, each individual within that office should be trained on. And so typically one of the things that you want to make sure that they understand is first, how to turn it on. That's one of the key things, is you want to be able to attach that delivery system to the tank. You need to learn how to turn on the key on top of the tank. And then you're going to regulate and look at the flow meter or the knobs, and then have an understanding of the delivery of that. And then the key thing here is, like I said, every single oxygen tank may be different. This is why I'm saying that staff needs to be trained on that particular emergency equipment. So I think the connection, being able to turn it on, being able to read it, and then being able to administer that delivery system for that oxygen. And then once that's completed, learning how to remove all the delivery systems, turning off the key, and then also turning it to the flow to go ahead and let that oxygen dissipate. And then you actually need to bleed gently, closing that knob to make sure that all oxygen is no longer flowing through there. And so these are some of the things that I think that most individuals will have to be trained on, because you don't want to learn on the fly. When there's an emergency, that's the worst thing you can do. Is you're wasting time, especially in a certain situation where a patient is going into cardiac arrest. This is why practicing this monthly situation here with your team and staff, I think, is very critical. So when emergencies happen, everybody can work together.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Henry, you are recommending that the team not only checks their system, checks their equipment on a monthly basis, but they do refresher training so everybody is up to date on what to do. Do I understand that correctly? Monthly?
Mary, and that's great. I think monthly, at least checking it monthly. The training, I highly recommend, once a year at the least. I mean, if they want to do it monthly, that's perfect. That's great. I can never emphasize overtraining, but the thing here is that at least once a year. Now, obviously, most medical professionals have to have their basic life support CPR certification. So I always highly, highly recommend having that very close to the same time that you're going to go ahead and renew your BLS. Most of the trainings that I do are typically in offices, so I do with the whole staff. And so what we'll normally do is we'll set up the CPR certification, then I'll come back, or maybe later that day, what I may end up doing is also providing an oxygen training class on how to connect it to the oxygen tank, how to turn it on, how to use that ambu bag along with the oxygen tank. So, Mary, the thing that I at least ask is at least have them focus on doing the training whenever, at least once a year, and then also in coordination when they have to do their BLS recertification there in the office.
Great suggestion. And of course, that should be part of the onboarding process for a new employee, no matter what their capacity, whether it's administrative or clinical, coming into the practice, because as you stated before, Henry, the equipment may be different. So they need to be given that orientation as part of their onboarding.
Mary, that is a fantastic point. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because OSHA does require any new employee to be trained. And that's one of the things is when we talk about an onboarding process, that's why I always ask the office, where's your onboarding process for a new employee? They need to have that. They need to check it off. The employee needs to sign it, and the compliance officer should sign it too, because that could be one of the questions that could come up in case of an emergency does happen and Cal OSHA happens to go through and ask them or investigate something. Has your employee been trained on this? Well, yes, they have. Here's our training record. Here's her signature. Here's my signature. And at that point, then that shows that you've gone through the proper training with that. So great point, Mary.
And Henry, I just have to jump in here because that is so very important, because the divas, we've all noticed, and this is a trend in many industries, there's just a labor shortage. We're not finding enough hygienists, assistants, doctors. And so more people are coming into our profession with little to no dental experience. And as a result, they may not have any experience or background in these medical areas. And so it's important that they get onboarded properly and this be put into the sequence of onboarding all new employees. So thank you both for bringing that important point. And not just would OSHA maybe ask for these training records, however, so would a plaintiff's attorney if something happens to a patient. So with that, Leslie, I'm going to turn this over to you again. So
great, Linda. And, it's really been wonderful to hear all of these important points, that things that we don't often think about. And especially with the importance of having that ambu bag hooked up. But, Henry, I'm not sure if you had covered for us what would happen if someone was not trained on an ambu bag. If you could give us some reasons why a team should go ahead and learn how to use an ambu bag before an accident happens, and what would happen if they overuse an ambu bag or apply too much pressure?
Leslie, that's great. And so during my BLS trainings, that's one of the key things that I look at is how to properly administer that oxygen through that ambu bag. And so some of the common errors that I typically see with an ambu bag is having that proper seal in regards while you're administering. So we have that pocket mask attached to the ambu bag. When we place that pocket mask on the patient at that point and getting ready to administer, it has to have a seal around the mouth and the nose and on the sides. And so typically how to position their hand and how to properly seal that ambu bag is very important, because a couple of mistakes that could happen is that if you don't have a proper seal, we may have the oxygen leaking out through one side of the mask. You know, the other thing also that they may have, and you brought up a very good point, is what happens if we overinflate or give too much oxygen. And so typically what happens is if you give too much oxygen, it bypasses the lungs, goes into the stomach, and causes something that's called gastric inflation, which then all of a sudden all this air builds up in the stomach, and then all of a sudden they start vomiting out, and then all of a sudden people are kind of afraid, what did I do wrong? So that's something there, Leslie, that's really key and important, is the proper amount to administer. So when they administer that, they just want to see enough to see that chest rise. And so practicing during that BLS skills is very key and vital and important. So thank you for bringing up that point.
And Henry, there's a lot of points that you covered today that I just want to briefly recap on. You talked about where to store the tank, that it needs to be in a place that's well ventilated and secure from falling over. I know that if an oxygen tank falls over, that it could take off like a missile. It's compressed gas. So making sure that it's secure, making sure that you check the hoses monthly, that the ambu bag is in a sealed bag and it's right next to the oxygen tank itself, and that should be what is hooked up as opposed to the face mask. I think you called it the pocket mask. And that the reason for the ambu bag being hooked up to the oxygen was that that's delivering 100% oxygen and you have control of it. So that all makes a lot of sense to me. You also talked about onboarding and having employees and whoever the trainer is in a dental practice sign off so that there's proof that the training has been done. And then we also wanted to make sure that everybody understands how to read a regulator and how to start the flow of oxygen. So the 2 videos that we have will be very helpful for that purpose, and it can even be used for training. Henny, is there anything to add to that on main points to recap what we've covered so far today?
Yes, I mean, Leslie, I think some of the main points to be able to look at is when we talk about an emergency, medical emergencies that I've seen, some offices tend to leave this out in the training, in certain situations that do come up. The other thing is that we always are focused on the patient. What happens to the patient? Well, one of the things is what happens to the doctor or the dentist at that point. How are we going to handle that situation? And so this is why I always say that usually you want your whole staff trained, so that in case if it is one of the providers that are having to provide that CPR, someone else can step in and kind of take control of that certain situation. And so one of the things here is in that emergency action plan, as you know, it needs to be written and it needs to be explained, and it also needs to be practiced. That's the biggest thing, I think, is that they're not practicing that emergency action plan. And like I said, we typically cover fires or acts of violence or things of that certain situations, but medical emergencies are very key. And the thing here is that everybody has a responsibility, so that if something does happen, let's just say in the waiting room, we're going to have maybe a person initially maybe moving some of the other patients outside, so they're not all huddling around in that waiting room. And then we may have another individual calling 911. We have another individual getting the first aid equipment, and then we'll have the other individuals administering that CPR, and maybe that third person waiting outside for the ambulance to come in. And so everybody in the office has a role, not just 1 or 2 people. And this is why I'm saying practicing these emergency action plans is very critical, because time is of the essence. And if there's a lot of confusions and people don't know what to do, it becomes very chaotic. So I would probably say practicing and training that EAP would be one of the most relevant things that I can see there to add.
And I can see how dental teams might dismiss that as being, well, we're not going to have an emergency. It's sort of like, who who would really be prepared unless you actually had an emergency and then you say, well, gee, we really fell short. So that could mean a patient loses their life over falling short and not having conducted the drills. I actually had an opportunity to experience one of the drills in a larger clinic where they had a medical and a dental facility together. And it was a fairly large group of individuals. I think they must have had 100 employees that were on site that day. And while I was there conducting some training with the dental team, they shared with me that they were going to be having a code drill, and I can't remember. I think they said it was called silver. I'm not positive, but they said we're going to basically, nobody else knows about it, but we'll be getting together. We'll be meeting in the reception room as though a patient in the reception room was having a medical emergency, and we're going to go through all the parts. And I watched this. It was really a great demonstration, and it was something that was spur of the moment. So the team members were not prepared in advance, but everybody learned from it and everybody understood what their part was. And I think that's really an important thing for dental teams to think about doing. Larger facilities do these types of drills all the time, particularly if they have joint commissions oversight where they have their audits, and the auditors are looking for evidence that this kind of training and these kind of drills were done. So private practices should be well aware of that in their setting up their emergency action plan and putting their training budget into place for the year. Are there any other comments from our fellow divas regarding the oxygen tank or anything, stories, personal stories? Linda, I think you had something you wanted to share.
I do, Leslie. So when you think about having these kind of mock drills, in the medical world, they often refer to them as code blue drills. And I think that's very important because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, more and more offices are hiring individuals with little to no dental experience just because of our talent shortage at this time. And then you couple that with the fact that more offices are providing in-office sedation. So the risk goes up with both of those factors. And I think we can incorporate something like this, make it simple, make it easy, just work it right in. And even on your monthly team member meetings, I've always recommended add safety and compliance to that list. There might be one or two things you want to talk about, because if an emergency comes up, let's face it, if there's a failed autoclave, you're going to deal with that failed autoclave test then. You're not going to wait to the monthly meeting. But there are other things that you can talk about at that meeting. How are we with our emergency oxygen? Where's this? Where's that? Everybody will bring these checklists to the meeting, and the doctor then can hold everyone to accountability that these checklists are being done in the background and that the office is truly as safe as they think it is and want it to be, Leslie.
Linda, that's great information. Mary.
In addition to Linda's suggestion of adding this information to the team meetings, I think it's a really good idea for the morning huddle when everyone has reviewed their patient records of the day. Of course, a medical emergency can happen for anyone, but many practices have patients who are medically complex. And so it could be something that's kind of like a red flag. Just keep in mind that, this patient is a prime candidate for a potential medical emergency. So let's just be on the alert. I do have a doctor who made an agreement with a patient who was her friend to come in and do a fake emergency during the workday. She was scheduled for treatment, and they created a scenario together, didn't tell the rest of the team, and the team was critiqued then on how they responded to that. And it really hit home with them that they weren't as prepared as they thought they were.
I bet that would ring true for a lot of dental practices. And what a great idea to have somebody, sort of like a mystery shopper when you have someone call on the phone, but have a patient. I would just hope that they wouldn't actually call 911 and initiate emergency services if it was a drill. And so that would be a great thing to do for every dental practice. Again, we're just coming up with all sorts of great information. Henry, I think you had a very special checklist that would be of value to our listeners. Would you give us information on where they can get that checklist?
Yeah, sure, Leslie. As I mentioned, the reason why I like checklists is because it just makes sure that we cover all the steps. And then the other thing, I think Linda brought up a very great point, is documentation. That's one of the things when any type of situation comes up or you're getting audited, they're going to request for documentation. So on this checklist, it does show a step-by-step guide on making sure that individual runs through the procedures on how to connect it, how to turn it on, how to monitor that oxygen tank, and then how to use it, and then also how to basically turn it off. And so if they want a checklist like this is a good foundation that they can go ahead at least and start, and they can always develop their own, but this gives them at least a starting foundation. They can go ahead and email me at Henry, Henry, at blueoceansafety.com. So that's Henry, Henry, at blueoceansafety.com, or they can call me at 559-301-5195.
Fantastic, Henry. We're also going to make available on the Compliance Divas website the videos that you had sent to me on showing the steps for how to read a regulator. And I think that'll be very helpful for teams in learning how to set up their oxygen tank and make sure that they've done it the right way and check the actually levels of oxygen. And I also, in closing today, besides thanking Henry Serrano for having a great wealth of information for our listeners, I know I learned a lot, and I'm going to be taking this information out to my clients and audiences. Thank you, Henry. And I want to close by saying we bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating regulatory compliance to keep you on course. Please submit your questions to support@thecompliancedivas.com and look for our resources that we mentioned also in the show notes of your podcast. And with that, I'd like to close this podcast and welcome you back to subscribe to thecompliancedivas.com and to please access that checklist through Henry at blueoceansafety.com.